To wish everyone happy holidays in whatever way you choose to celebrate the holidays. And we want to talk this morning about the theme that's so prevalent in front of us in society at this time. And that is, what is Christmas? What is the meaning of Christmas? Today we're looking at Dr. Holmes' chapter in a textbook called Finding the Christ. Finding the Christ. And you'll hear people, you'll see them on the street corners, you'll see them on TV, and they're saying, put the Christ back in Christmas. Let's get the X out of it. Let's put the Christ back in Christmas. And what they're doing, of course, is they're encouraging people to come to their understanding of what Christmas is. But what is our understanding? What is your understanding? What is my understanding? See, it's not good enough for us to have somebody else's understanding of anything. That may be a good place to start as we're going through life. But eventually we have to become owners of our own consciousness. We have to take accountability and responsibility for what we do believe. And we have to examine those beliefs. And we have to let go of the ones that no longer serve us, and we have to take in more of the ones that do. Now, Meister Eckhart was a Catholic monk, lived around 1300 in Germany, in the Rhine Valley, where the mystics were kind of flourishing at that time. And he was a mystic. And he was a simple parish priest, and he said Mass weekly, and he gave a weekly homily, a sermon. And one year for Christmas he said something that must have been quite shocking in the world of his time. Because he reminded his congregation that they had come together on Christmas Eve to commemorate the birth of a small child in Bethlehem some 1,300 years before. And then he told them, but if they didn't know what that meant to them, if they didn't have a realization or an understanding of what it meant to them personally, to each and every one personally, it might as well never have happened. Now I say that was kind of shocking for his day and his time, because at that time the church was telling people, well, you don't need to know anything, you just need to do whatever it is that we tell you to do. We are in charge of your salvation for you. And all you have to do is simply follow the rules that have been given to you, and all will be taken care of. And here's Meister Eckhart telling people, no, you need to understand what this means to you, or else it may as well never have happened. And this, of course, is the way the Gnostics and the mystics will think. In level 1 consciousness that we talk about, everything is about behavior, following the rules, obeying authority. But when you start to move into the next level of thinking, it's not enough simply to blindly obey. Of course, blind obedience there's nothing wrong with following the rules and doing the things that are morally right to do. But we need to understand why they're morally right. We need to come to an understanding of finding that guidance within us, so that even if there were no one else there to give us a rule to live by, we would instinctively be in touch with, as Dr. Holmes tells us, that part of us that already knows right from wrong, good from bad. And we would be conducting ourselves in a manner that is for the highest good of all. So that's what we want to do here today. We want to kind of look at these ideas about what is the Christ, what is Christmas, what does it mean to us? Is it the same as or different than it was perhaps when we were children, or is it the same as or different than perhaps what folks standing on the corner with a sign, put Christ back in Christmas? Is our interpretation, our personal interpretation, any different than theirs? So let's look at this a little bit. Let's start with Dr. Holmes' definition of the Christ. And it's very, very important, I think, that we come to that definition or that understanding of our own, because so much of our culture is influenced by traditional Christianity, if there really is such a thing. I mean, there are so many different sects of Christianity. But so much of what we see in the media in this country, so much of what we see in public in this country, self-identifies with Christianity. And yet we have to ask ourselves, well, what do people mean by the Christ? What do we mean by the Christ? Is the Christ a person named Jesus who was born a long time ago? Or is the Christ a principle, as Dr. Holmes would tell us? A principle that exists in each and every one of us. The Christ is that place in realization, that place in consciousness, where the human and divine meet. Now, Meister Eckhart also told his people that God never begot only one son, one child, but the eternal is forever begetting the only begotten. And what he was telling his people is that each and every one of us, if we stop and realize what we are, each and every one of us has the principle of the Christ within us. Each and every one of us is the Christ, in that we are a place where the human and the divine meet. So the person Jesus was one who exemplified more perfectly the Christ principle than perhaps others in history. But the person Jesus also told us that we are one. We are all one. And that everything that he could do, we could do, if we would go within and seek first the kingdom. So what has happened is in society, in our culture, as people start to formulate ideas of who and what they are, they focus on differences. We are not like those people over there, whoever those people over there happen to be. We believe this way and they believe that way. And the first level of organized human consciousness, the first level of maturation, maturing, if that's what we want to call it, is one that focuses on the differences. And you'll see this when people come together and they start to talk to one another. If they open themselves up and start to talk about religious ideas, they immediately go to the things that are different. I remember when we moved to North Carolina from New York back in the 70s. At the time we were going to the Catholic Church, and there were very few Catholics in Hickory, North Carolina at that time. And of course in the South, first thing people want to know is where do you go to church? And being very hospitable and inviting you to church and want to make sure that you have a good church home to go to and all those sorts of things. And if I would tell them that I went to the Catholic Church, they would immediately say, well, why do you have to eat fish on Friday? They immediately would go to something that was different than their particular way of believing, and focus on it. And we do that. We as human beings do that. We try to focus in on what's different instead of looking at what's similar and how we are more alike than we are different. But as we move on, then we start to move on in consciousness as we start to kind of grow. Then we start to look at how things are similar, how things are more alike, in fact, than they are different. And if we look at this idea of the celebration around the winter solstice, this idea of the light coming back, of the days getting longer. If we look at the celebration of lights, we have celebration of lights in Judaism, In Hanukkah, we have celebration of lights, festival of lights. I think it's Diwali. In Hinduism, the pagan cultures, we call them pagan. It just meant the religion of the people who lived in the country. So I mean nothing derogatory by that. But the native religions, if you will, the aboriginal religions, it was a special time. The solstice was a special time. It was a time for celebration. It was a time when there was a connection, a connection between humanity and nature that we've lost. We've lost as we moved into a technological society. You know, if you tend to crops, if you raise animals in the field, if you're out there at night, you know, looking over your sheep, you become keenly aware of the cycle and the rhythm of life, and how the stars move through the heavens. But the pole star doesn't. It just stays in one place. You know, a skilled observer, a sailor at sea, or a watchman in the field, they can tell what time it is by the position of the stars. They can tell what season it is by the position of the stars. And they were keenly aware of the length of the days growing shorter and shorter until it got to the solstice, the shortest day of the year. Now, at that time of the year, as I spoke a couple weeks ago, at that time of the year, people were naturally indoors. It was too cold in our hemisphere to be out of doors. People were naturally indoors. So here's a clue. The narratives in the New Testament about the shepherds being out in the field watching over their sheep, that wasn't so. They wouldn't be out in the field watching over their sheep at the winter solstice. It would be too cold. The grass would be dormant. And the importance of that is that the celebration of the Christmas holiday by the early Christian church was placed deliberately at the time of the winter solstice, because that's when people naturally wanted to do something. There was something within humanity that had a need to recognize this event, to celebrate this event. So a couple things were going on. People were indoors. They had gathered in their harvest. They had brought in their food and preserved it for the next year. They had put aside their seed for next year. They had taken the best 10% of their livestock to save for breeding. They had given their tithes to their temple. They had slaughtered the animals that they didn't want to feed through the winter. They had preserved the meat, and there was plenty to eat, and there was plenty to drink. And it was too cold to go outside, and people would stay inside by the fire. You know, this is where the tradition of the Yule log came from. It was a log so big it would burn for a week. People didn't have to go outside. And they would eat, and they would drink, and they would be merry. So there's a natural time of people getting together, a natural time of celebrating and of sharing and of swapping stories and of planning for the next year. And the other thing that was going on is that as the days got shorter, people were connected to that cycle of life. They were connected to the rhythm of life, to the pulse of life. And they knew that as certain as the solstice had passed, as soon as the days began to get longer once again, the promise of life had returned. Because as the solstice came, inevitably the equinox would come, and there would be spring, and there would be planting, and the animals would be giving birth, and there would be the bounty and the celebration of life that became the Easter festival. So the people knew then that there was this rhythm, that there was this cycle, that there was this connectedness to something that was so much greater than anyone. Right? 2% of the sun's energy makes it to the planet Earth. The other 98% goes off into space somewhere. 2% of the sun's energy is all that manages to land on planet Earth, and that is enough energy to sustain all of life as we know it, all of the plants and all of the animals and all of the humans. The coal that we burn to make electricity, the wood that we burn in our fireplaces. All of that, excuse me, all of that is the energy of the sun that has been temporarily locked up in the form of wood or coal, that is temporarily locked up in the form of animals or vegetables or people. All of life, as Earth knows it, depends upon sunlight. And when that sunlight started to come back, when the days started to get longer, when the solstice had passed, it was a time of celebration because it meant that the promise of life had been renewed. That we were all connected to something so much bigger, so much grander than what it appeared to be. That it was a time to pause and to reflect. So what tends to happen is as cultures come together, when cultures collide, what they tend to do is they tend to absorb each other's holidays. There are certain times of the year that it just seems natural for people to celebrate. The solstices and the equinoxes, are times when people come together and celebrate. And each culture might have a different celebration with kind of the same theme, but Joseph Campbell might call it, has a different costume put upon it. But there's just something within people that wants to acknowledge the significance of that time of the year, the significance of what is going on. And that is so deeply ingrained in our society that when cultures come together, whichever one is the most dominant naturally wants the other cultures to give up their religion and to start to believe in the way that the dominating culture does. But people won't give up their way of believing. They won't give up their holidays. They won't give up the significance of it. So what has to happen is the conquering religion, if you want to call it that, has to somehow absorb those holidays. It has to take them in and give them its own flavor and somehow make it their own. So for example, in Easter we have children going around and we're dyeing eggs and we have little bunny rabbits and all of these things that are symbols of the abundance of spring that predated Christianity. But somehow they have become part of Christianity now as it is celebrated. And Easter has come to mean the time when Jesus came back, when Jesus rose from the dead, and life was renewed at a different level, not just at the physical level of spring, but at a different level, at the spiritual level. And the same thing goes for around the solstice. People would get together and they wanted to party and they wanted to eat and they wanted to drink and they wanted to be merry and they wanted to feel their oneness, their connectedness. So when Christianity kind of moved into Rome, became the official religion of Rome, the Romans had a festival they called Saturnalia. Saturnalia was a big party, and the Christians couldn't stop the Romans from celebrating Saturnalia. So what they tried to do is they tried to sanctify it. They tried to take it over, and they tried to take the party out of it, and they tried to make it about recognizing the birth of Jesus. They tried to make it a holy day. And of course what happened is people still wanted to party. They still had a desire to celebrate. And it was quite a problem because here was a great holy celebration that was a big party. So what happened is in Christianity for many years, particularly after Reformation, after the Protestant Reformation and different sects of Christianity developed, right, was people stopped celebrating Christmas. They thought it was improper to celebrate the birth of Jesus with a party like that. And when the Puritans first came to this country, it was in fact a crime to celebrate Christmas Day. If you didn't show up for work on Christmas Day, you could be fined or put in the stocks. But people wanted to party. So the Catholic Church kept their celebration of Christmas. They kept celebrating Christmas. Whereas the non-Catholic Christian church didn't want to celebrate Christmas. They thought Easter was their major holiday. So what was happening is at Christmas time you had a lot of non-Catholic people going to the Catholic Church because they wanted to party. They wanted to celebrate Christmas. And eventually the other denominations in this country had to start celebrating. And then it became what it is today. And what we have today is kind of a mixture of mythologies. The Christmas tree came to us again from pre-Christian times, from Europe, the evergreen being the symbol of everlasting life. And what we have now is more of a commercial holiday than a religious holiday. It's about stuff and shopping. And one program I was watching on the origins of Christmas said, Christmas as we know it is a uniquely American holiday. It was invented by marketing people who gave us a saint who lives in Macy's and kind of ushers in the shopping season at the end of the parade. And we've lost that connection, you see, we've lost that connection to this magic of life, to this feeling of life, to what does this mean to us. And what this means to us, what we're trying to sort through here, what we're trying to get to is that the discovery of the Christ, the discovery of the fact that we are, what we are is not something that we made, that what we are is something that God is doing as us and God is doing through us, that our own hearts could not beat if it were not the love of God that was beating them, that our lungs could not work if it was not the activity of God within them. We start to recognize then that we are in fact spiritual beings now. We start to get this idea that the Christ is right here, the Christ being the point where the human meets the divine. And this is what Christmas is about. It's for me, it's about recognizing this connection, recognizing this presence, recognizing this love that is here, and getting rid of the ideas of separation by saying, well, Jesus lived a long time ago and he was one of a kind. He was the only Christ. And instead it's saying he exemplified the principle of the Christhood, the presence of the divine within each and every one of us. And he told us that we too could do everything that he did, and that we are one with him and with the Father. And what that means to me is that there is a principle within me, a place within me where the divine life that created whatever I am, but created me out of itself, where it has become human, where it walks and talks as me, where it eats as me, where it loves as me, where it cares as me, where it feels as me. And Christmas is about awakening to that presence within. So if we go and we look at the traditional narratives in the Gospels of the Christmas story, and as I said, keep in mind that that the Christmas holiday was deliberately placed around the solstice because the early church wanted to kind of take over the holidays, the celebrations that people were having, and turn them to its own purpose, to bring people's attention away, if you will, from the partying and the celebration and the overeating and the overdrinking and all those things, and bringing them to realize their connection to something much greater than that. Not that there's anything wrong with eating and drinking and all those things in and of themselves, but to bring our attention away from being totally focused on the material aspect of life. To recognize the light within, the light of the Spirit within. To become aware of our own soul, of the presence of God within. So the people who wrote the narratives, if you go back and you look at the Christmas narratives in the Gospel, if you look at them in terms of they were put there for a reason, they were put there to teach by means of a story, a parable, a mythology, and that they are leading us to an even deeper truth than the literal meaning of the stories can ever give to us. They then become sort of a guide for our own awakening, for our own realization, for our own understanding, as Meister Eckhart might have put it, of what discovering the Christ means to us. So if we take this story, and I'm just going to hit the highlights of them, but if we take the stories together, we kind of start with, first of all, it's a really tough time, The people in Palestine at that time were living under brutal force of the Romans. They had partnered with the Romans to kick out the Greeks, and what they got was worse than what they had. Now you have to keep in mind the tradition of the people who lived there was that they were the promised ones, the chosen ones, excuse me. They lived in the promised land. And there's this long history of a relationship with God, a tumultuous relationship with God, if you look over that history. In that at times the people were very, very close to God, close to their relationship, close to their feeling, close to their realization of God, and then they would drift away from that. See? And as they would drift away from that, problems would creep into society. And then a prophet would come along, and the prophet would say, well, the reason you're having all this trouble is because you drifted away from your relationship with God. You're not doing the things that God asks you to do. Remember, level 1 consciousness is about behavior, so you're not doing the things that God wants you to do. And people would kind of drift back into a closer understanding, a closer relationship to God, and then they would drift away. And you just kind of look through that history, you read through the history, and it's there. Right? Good times, bad times, good times, bad times. And certainly right around the time that Jesus was born, it was tough times. The people had been carried off hundreds of years earlier. They had been carried off in captivity to Persia, to Babylon. And there they got introduced to an idea that they never held before, and that is the idea of the Prince of Darkness, which came from Persia, from Zoroastrianism. There was no devil as we understand it today, there was no devil in the earliest Old Testament times. So people started to get this idea, well, maybe we're drifting away from what we're supposed to be doing because there's one who tempts us. There's a tempter that takes us away. There's an evil power that causes these things to happen. And of course, Sherlock Holmes kind of poked fun at that with Moriarty. Holmes said Moriarty must exist because these terrible things can't just possibly happen by themselves. And people started to get the idea that there was this other power other than God, other than oneness, other than love, and other than wholeness. There was this other power that was the cause of the terrible things that were happening. And of course we would look at that now and say it's human nature to do that, to find somebody else to make responsible for our own shortcomings. But we must recognize that we are the only thinker in our universe. We are ultimately the only ones responsible. I want you to think about anything that you have ever experienced in your life. If you were in Europe, if you were on a cruise ship, if you were on an airplane, anything that you have ever experienced in your life, and I'd ask you, where did you experience? And you might say, well, I was in Italy or I was in France. But that's not where you experienced it. That's where your body was at the time that you experienced it. But the only place that you have ever experienced anything is within your own consciousness. The entire world comes to us, if you will, through our senses, and comes in somewhere to a point where it touches our consciousness. And it is there that we form our perceptions and our ideas and our opinions, and it is there we have our experiences. Even as I sit here and I hold my hands up and I can feel the temperature of the air on my hands, I am not feeling it in my hands. There is something in my consciousness that is interpreting what is going on and gives me the sensation of feeling it at my skin. But my skin of itself feels nothing. It is my consciousness that interprets it. So the only place that we will find good or evil is in our consciousness. The only place that we will find a closer relationship or a more distant relationship with God is in our consciousness. So here we have the stories set out in a group of people who were feeling very separated from God at the time. Oh God, why are you letting this happen to us? We were your chosen people. This is the promised land, and now look what we've got. We've got the Greeks and then the Romans. We have all this trouble. We need help. There needs to be one who can come and rise up and take us out of our trouble and lead us back into our relationship with you. This is the environment where the story is set forth. And then we have a young woman. Her name is Mary. Now, if you look at Mary, Mary means mistress of the sea. Right? Like the seas on the moon, Mare, M-A-R-E. The Mediterranean is Mare, the sea. And the sea represents consciousness, the subconsciousness. So Mary represents that part of human consciousness that was still functioning at a level that knew God. It was night and she was alone and she was in prayer. And in that moment, the angel Gabriel, and the angels represent divine ideas. This divine idea came to her. This divine idea came to her that God is already present within. Already right there. Right now. The story tells it in terms of she will have a child, and the child's name will be Emmanuel, meaning God is with us. And that is what will become the Savior. That is what will become the thing that leads them out of trouble. The presence of God within. That is what will take the people out of their trouble. And of course, Mary says, I don't understand how that can be. I'm not even married yet. And of course, the angel, famous words, with God all things are possible. With God all things are possible. And then we have Joseph, and Joseph, if you will, in times, if you look in the scriptures, Joseph is one that God reveals things to the Josephs of the Bible. You have Joseph who went to Egypt and became the interpreter of dreams. Joseph is one that God speaks to in dreams. Again, something that is taking place not at a level of the intellect, but at the level of the soul. And Joseph is concerned, and he says, this is trouble because we're not even married and she's pregnant. And in those times, the penalty for such was to be stoned to death, and he did not want that to happen. And he was going to just go through with the marriage and later on divorce Mary quietly. But again, in a dream, the angel, the idea of God came and said, don't be worried. this is all God's doing. This is all okay. This is all good. And he trusted. And he listened and he trusted. So then we're told that the time comes for the child to be born. And the authors of the scripture give us a literary device of a census, that everybody had to go back to the town their family came from to be counted in a census for tax purposes. And of course that didn't happen. That was just something that was a construct that the authors used as a way of getting this child to be born in Bethlehem. Bethlehem being the city of bread. That's what Bethlehem means. And Joseph was from the house of David, and David means love. See? So this idea of the presence of God being born into our consciousness is an idea that comes from love. It doesn't come to us through ordinary human means. That's why Mary had to be a virgin, to demonstrate that this idea did not come into being through ordinary means. It is a divine idea that she awakened to. She awakened to in the quiet of the night, in turning her attention to God. So Mary and Joseph, they go to Bethlehem in the story, and there's no room for them at the inn. And of course, in our little nativity plays that the children put on all across the country, the innkeeper is a mean man who turns him away, and that's not what the way that worked in that culture at all. Inns were kind of like dormitories where people just kind of slept in cots in the open. There was just no place to have a child. There was no place for a woman to have privacy to give birth. So they went to the cave. They went to the stable where the animals were kept. And that's where she gave birth. And that's where this idea of the presence of God that would lead people out of trouble and back into their relationship with the divine, it was born in a stable, surrounded by animals, tenderly wrapped in swaddling clothes and baby's clothes, and then put in the manger, right? in the city of bread, put in the manger, as symbolism that this idea of the presence of God within us, the Christ within us, is the true food for the world. This is what the world really needs, is to awaken to our own spiritual identity, to awaken to the presence of God within us. Now there's a couple things significant about this child, this idea of being born as a child and being born in a stable. And the first is that when we begin to become aware of the presence of God within us, the Christ within us, see, it's not fully developed yet. It's still in its infancy. If it came to us, if the awareness came to us fully developed, we would not be mature enough to handle it. We could not handle the power that it has. So we have to awaken to it gradually, see. It comes to us as a child, and it has to be nurtured, and it has to be loved. And we have to give it time, and we have to give it attention. Like Mary wrapped it in the swaddling clothes. We have to take this beautiful idea of the presence of God within us, and we have to love it. We have to nurture it. We have to care for it. We have to feed it with our spiritual practice, with our meditation, with our education, with the time that we take just to be with it. And the other thing about it being born in the stable is that when this awareness comes to us, right, that God is with us, you see, that is so important. God is with us. It's not that we're separated from God or we're different than or we're apart from, but the very love of God is right here where we are. Nearer than our hands and feet, closer than our breath. That there is a spark of divinity within us, as the poet says, that we might We might be able to diminish, but we can never desecrate, but we can never extinguish. That there is that which we have been looking for out there that we can find only in our own consciousness in here. And when we go looking in here, we find out that some of the stuff that's in our consciousness is more fit for being in a stable than it is for being in the presence of God. We're caught up in the ways of the world. We're caught up in all of the things we need to do to make a living. We're caught up in all the politics. We're caught up in all the hate and discontent. We're caught up in all of the things of human experience. And now we have to come to the point that we are the very center where the divine meets the human. And we must decide to allow the divinity within to grow and to displace the humanity, to displace the human ways of thinking, the human ways of being, the human ways of acting. Dr. Holmes tells us that as Jesus grew, the divinity overtook the humanity. The humanity gave way to the divinity. That the very life that animated him, the same life that animates us, but we don't realize it to the same degree, for example, that he might have. But that same life force, which is the life of God that animates us, is capable of doing all the miracles, doing all that needs to be done. And this is why we're told everything that I have done you can do as well, but seek first the kingdom. And where do we go to seek the kingdom but within? See, the only place we're going to experience God is in our own consciousness. Never out there. We can go on a pilgrimage halfway around the world, and it may have a significant feeling quality to us, but that feeling is still taking place in our own consciousness. So what I'm suggesting is that when we look at what's going on around us at this time of the year, all of the different things that people talk about, what Christmas is and what Christmas means, this is an opportunity for us to recognize that we are part of a greater cycle of life than we can realize, that we have reached a significant milestone in the year where there is this promise in nature that comes back that says, because the light is growing stronger, life will grow stronger. And then there's the metaphysical promise that says, as we awaken to the light, the enlightenment, the light within us, the presence of God within us, that it too will grow stronger. But we have to nourish it. We have to care for it. We can't just say, oh, good, it's in there, and go back to doing whatever it was that we were doing before. We have to take the time to let it grow. We have to take the time simply to be with it. Joel Goldsmith suggests that we take at least once a day and we just simply sit to be in the presence without anything else on our agenda. I'm not going there to pray for anything. I'm not going there to ask for anything. I'm not going there to count my blessings. I'm not going there for any other reason than simply to experience the presence of God within, to be still and to know. We nurture it with our spiritual practice by taking our time to meditate, to break the cycle of human thought, the chatter that just constantly goes back and forth, and to recognize that we are not what we think, but we are the observers of the thought, and to contemplate what that observer means, what that observer is, the very presence of God. There's a meditation that you can do where you be still and you just allow the sensory input to come in, whether it be sound, whether it be sight, whether it be feeling, whatever it is, but to follow that sensory input within and try to find the place within where it all comes together. Try to find that point in consciousness that is truly you, because you are not your body. You are not your ego. You are not your name. But you are a point in consciousness. And that point in consciousness is part of all consciousness, part of God's consciousness. And if we can allow ourselves, if we can follow, if you will, we can follow that input back till we get to the past the point of ideas, past the point of ego, past the point of intellect, then we can start to experience the presence that is there. Beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field, and Rumi will meet us there. Let us take time daily to go to that field. Let us take time to study, to open our mind up to new and to different ideas, to read the works of the mystics, to read the poetry of the mystics, to allow ourselves to be carried away to a higher place within our own consciousness. So what happens is, as the gospel narratives continue, we are told that the child continued to grow into wisdom and understanding until he eventually became the Christ, one in whom the presence of God was visible, one who had allowed his humanity to give way to his divinity. And what we want to understand is that story is about you, and that story is about I, and that story is about each and every person. And the way the story ends is with the revelation, the mystical experience. One day John woke up and he had it. The oneness, the unity, the very experience of the presence of God within so fully, so completely, that there was no sense of self and of other. Now, of course, he tried to describe the ineffable in the mystical, metaphysical metaphors of the day. And that's why we don't understand the book of Revelation. It's written for a different time and a different place about something that can't even be written about. But all we need to know and all we need to take away for our consideration today is that presence, the Christ, it's not a last name of a little boy. The Christ is a term that means the principle, the presence of God within, the place where the human meets the divine within consciousness. That Christ principle is already within each and every one of us. If not, we would not be here. We could not eat. We could not drink. We would not breathe. But we must realize it. We must realize it and experience it. We must take time to acknowledge it, to celebrate it, to spend time with it, to love it, to nurture it, to treat it as we would treat lovingly a child, and to allow it to grow within us until it surpasses us, our human us, until it surpasses the human part of us, and it becomes the only real thing in our life. The presence of God within. The greatest gift that has ever been given is already here. It is already within you. It is already within I. But each one of us must unwrap that present for our own self. Through our prayer, through our meditation, through our education, and through simply taking the time when it's quiet in the still of the night and turning our attention to God and listening to the voice of our angel telling us what we should do, where we should go, and how we should do it. So at this time of the year, most of the world comes together to celebrate the birth of a baby some 2,000 years ago in Palestine. But unless you and I know what it means to us, it might as well have never happened. So I invite you to take time this holiday season to do nothing. To do nothing but sit and be with the presence. Allow it to become real, to become tangible, to become a friend, to become a guide, to become your teacher and your leader and your savior from all of the trouble that comes from believing in separation, in limitation, and in lack. You are God's present to the world. It's time to unwrap. And so it is.